All right, hello and welcome to the fourth virtual history of 2021, presented by Baltimore Architecture Foundation and Baltimore Heritage. My name is Nathan Denny's, Associate Director of BAF. First, thank you to everyone who has donated to be with us today. Your support will help us keep the series going through 2021. We already have a great lineup of programs heading into the spring. Speaking of, here are a few things we have lined up. Next week, we have Dr. Denise Marangolo presenting on the Preserve the Baltimore Uprising project, the project to develop a digital repository of content captured during the protests in 2015. On Tuesday, BAF is hosting a virtual architecture trivia night, which I'm sure viewers of virtual histories will be great at. And on February 12th, we're taking a look at the Herring Run Archaeology Project with co-directors Jason Schellenhamer and Lisa Kraus. And finally, on February 19th, we're celebrating the upcoming bicentennial of Frederick Law Olmsted with a presentation on some of our Olmsted parks in Baltimore with Sandy Sparks and Julian Storms, and co-presented by Friends of Maryland Olmsted Parks and Landscapes and the Maryland Society of Landscape Architects. You can register for all these programs at www.baltimorearchitecture.org. And if you miss a virtual history or want to return to one you've seen before, you can find them on our YouTube channel. Just search for Baltimore Architecture Foundation. And now today's presentation. Dale Glenwood Green is a professor of architecture and lead faculty for historic preservation at Morgan State University School of Architecture and Planning. He has been teaching and leading research on Black architects since he developed the Black Architects Seminar in 2010. He is also a partner in the architectural firm of Sulton Campbell Britt Associates, founded in 1964 by pioneering Black architects. If you have questions for Dale, please add them to the chat box and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. And if you type in the chat, those chats will go directly to me, the host, and I'll be reading those out at the end of the presentation for Dale. With that, take it away, Dale.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to this session on the early Black architects of Baltimore. I'm going to be speaking on a few of these early Black architects as defined by those that we were able to uncover dating back to 1901 and leading up to 1970. And I'll talk a bit about how we determined the 1970 cutoff date. I'm using as a subtitle, Lifting the Veil of Anonymity, because for many of these early Black architects, their legacy, their works have been under obscurity. They in and of themselves have been faceless and they have been nameless, and the contributions that they have made to both Maryland and also to the city of Baltimore, for the most part, had been very silent. Prior to embarking upon this work 10 years ago last year. And so I'm going to first start by giving a national overview to help those that may not be as familiar with the profession of architecture. Certainly the American Institute of Architects, as founded in 1857, founded by 13 white male architects, and during a time in the nation when slavery had not yet been abolished. Certainly the American Institute of Architects was not an organization when it was founded that included African-American men or women. Its first member that was African-American was admitted in 1923, which was Paul Revere Williams, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go forward. This year locally marks the 150th anniversary of the American Institute of Architects Baltimore chapter. And similarly, the founders of the AIA Baltimore chapter were white men, and we'll look a little bit at the history of African Americans' involvement with the AIA Baltimore chapter as we go forward as well. Very important to understand that the scarcity of Black architects in particular was a concern of a very noted civil rights leader named Whitney M. Young Jr., who was the president of the National Urban League and addressed the American Institute of Architects in 1968. And this became a very pivotal moment in the address. It was one where Whitney M. Young himself, of course, addressed the AIA for being most distinguished for their thunderous silence and complete irrelevance, as he quoted, towards the civil rights agenda and towards the inclusion of African Americans within the profession. It's important to understand, while we talk often about the profession and the disparities of African Americans and their involvement within the profession, which is essentially less than 2%. It's equally important to understand the disparities within the architectural education, in that the percentages of African American students is also quite low in America. It's 5%. There are more Latino students and Asian students, and of course, the lion's share of the students are white students at 44%. The number for the Black students, similar again to the professionals, has been at 5% for nearly a decade. Again, the African American registered architects is at about 2%. We will be looking at the importance of, as this 1965 publication indicated, the Negroes who helped build America. It's very important to understand that from slavery, Africans were brought to America to build essentially the new world. And many of them obviously were enslaved to the building traditions and practices early on here in America. One notable architectural family, African American, is of course the Mckissicks. The formerly enslaved Moses Mckissick, who came from West Africa and the Ashanti tribe, ultimately ended up becoming what we would consider to be an architect based on the trade that he learned in building. And then of course his lineage following behind him, his children, and then even down to today, the company being ran by two twins, Daryl and Cheryl Mckissick, who descend from this overall legacy. In 1905, Moses Mckissick III actually established the Mckissick and Mckissick firm, which is technically the oldest African American architecture firm, which, as I mentioned, is now ran by Cheryl and Daryl Mckissick. But all of this stems back to their early ancestor who was formerly enslaved. Another very early individual looking nationally is Horus King. He participated in the construction of bridges, and also in the design and construction of buildings. This is an 1841 courthouse in Alabama that he was responsible for as well. And then we look very early on at the institutions, the historically Black colleges and universities, and their role within this. Hampton Institute in 1871, and you can see here students studying architecture at Claflin in 1872. And earlier on, these programs were known as industrial arts and manual training. And then, of course, to Robert Robinson Taylor, whom in 1892 became the first formally trained African-American architect and graduated from MIT as the first Black graduate, and then was recruited to go to Tuskegee, where Dr. Booker T. Washington had him lead the, what is today the architecture program, then the mechanical industries department. And you see Robert Robinson Taylor there in the far right, here with his students that he's training at Tuskegee. We also look at the first graduates, African-American graduates of majority institutions like the University of Pennsylvania. This is Julian Francis Abel, who graduated as the first Black from the University of Pennsylvania. And you see him situated there in the middle of his white male peers in the chair. He had a prolific career with Horace and Trumbauer's firm for about 44 years. And we'll look at later one of his buildings that he did here in Maryland as well. First Black graduate and first Black New York registered architect, Wertner Woodson Tandy. who was a very prominent architect in New York and designed the palatial estate of Madam C.J. Walker that you can see here, and also her offices downtown in Broadway, New York. Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, and their program started in 1910. Howard's program started in 1919. Prairie View in 1920, and North Carolina A&T started in 1926, and then Southern in 1946. We also look at, of course, the first African-American woman to be licensed, which was Norma Scarlett. And also she was the first Black woman to be elected to the College of Fellows in 1980 and became the first Black licensed woman in 1954. We look at one of the first Black students to be court ordered to be admitted into the School of Architecture at Clemson University, which was Harvard Gantt. This is in 1963, and you can see the numerous headlines associated with this court order admitting a Negro to an architecture school, and in this case, Clemson University. And then we look at numerous cases where African-American, Negro, colored, Black, as they would have been referred to, architects and their various challenges and obstacles that they had to overcome in order to secure contracts to do work. And this is one was published in the Jet magazine in 1966 with the headline "Accept Negro Architect," which went on to become a 6-week controversy around a Black architect securing a contract, and largely was successful in being able to do so as a result of the sole Negro member on that board having great influence. Whitney M. Young Jr. in his 1968 address to AIA was quite transformative, because when we look at the context of what happened post that 1968 address, even leading to the establishment of the National Organization of Minority Architects in 1971, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. We have several key individuals who practiced in Maryland and had ties to Maryland that were associated with the establishment of NOMA as well. Leroy Miller Campbell, one of NOMA's founders, was a Washington, D.C. based architect, but also held offices here in Baltimore City that they opened in 1968. Robert J. Nash, who was the first Black AIA vice president in 1971 and was a NOMA founder, and the first Whitney M. Young Award winner in 1972, began practicing in Maryland in 1962. And then, of course, Leon Bridges, who was on the faculty recently and retired from Morgan State University, and was a very accomplished African-American architect here in the city. And he is actually one of the individuals that informed our 1970 date, because for Maryland and Baltimore, Leon Bridges was actually recorded as the first Black architect in Maryland with a 1970 date when he relocated here to Maryland and by way of Baltimore from the state of Washington. And so, of course, he's very much aware of all of this research, and I've had the opportunity, of course, to be on the faculty with him at Morgan, but certainly what you will see today is a litany of individuals that have been uncovered who were all sort of, as I said, under a veil of anonymity prior to 1970. And so we began a search to uncover all of those early, as we would call them, African-American architects whose records hadn't fully been depicted, who were practicing and existed here in Maryland before 1970. 1977, Morgan State University's program started initially as the Built Environment Studies and then was accredited in 1991. And of course, a key individual with Morgan's program was Harry G. Robinson, who's also obviously affiliated with Howard University's program. And then this year marks the 20th anniversary of Morgan's undergraduate architecture program, started in 2001 and under the leadership of Melvin Mitchell, who also had ties to Howard University's program. And in fact, I was one of the inaugural students of the 2001 program at Morgan, and I recall very vividly Melvin Mitchell and his publication that he was working on and his address that he had delivered at the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture in 2001. And he certainly was a great impetus to this work because he pushed celebrating the early African-American architects and bring a greater level of visibility to those firms and to the women and to the Black architects that practice. More recently, and in our efforts, we have been able to uncover the first African-American woman registered in the state of Maryland. We will look at other earlier African-American women who practiced but were not registered in the state. Certainly a colleague, Julian Storms, has been doing a lot of work on the early women in architecture in Maryland. And now there's, of course, a subgroup that's looking at the early African-American women, and I'm assisting in that effort as well. But it's important for us to uncover all of the women, both African-American and other as well. Sharon Sutton becomes the first African-American woman in the US to be promoted a full professor of architecture, and that's in the University of Michigan. It's 1984, 2008. Marsha Purnell becoming the first Black president of AIA. And then locally, Morgan graduate Kathleen Sherrill becomes the first Black president of AIA Maryland and the first Black president of AIA Baltimore. Baltimore in 2012 and AIA Maryland in 2016. And then, of course, Paul Revere Williams, who holds 3 critical distinctions as an African-American among the profession. One, he was the first to be admitted to AIA in 1923. He was the first Black to be elevated to the College of Fellows in 1957. And then he was the first African-American to be a recipient, and this is posthumously, of the gold medalist, and this is in 2017. And so he has quite the distinction among African-Americans within AIA. Baltimore's NOMA chapter, our more recent edition of the National Organization of Minority Architects as the official chapter here in Baltimore. And then David Adjay, a significant individual of color who's now one of the leading architects of the generation, most influential persons according to Times magazine, and has been behind numerous projects here in America. And of course, most are familiar with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. All of these things we can look at as post a 1968 effort of Whitney M. Young's address to AIA, Phil Freelon in his design fellowship for the students of color. And of course, our School of Architecture building has been designed by Phil Freelon. And then of course, he worked on the National Museum of African American History and Culture with Max Bond and David Adjay and Peter Cook and Daryl Mckissick and Zen Howard and a number of others that all worked on that project. And then we can see today Diane Hoskins, who got her start in the Baltimore office in Gensler, and now is the co-CEO of Gensler, which is the world's largest architecture firm, and an African-American woman leading more than 5,000 staff members in 46 offices in more than 120 countries. And so as we started this work, we knew that the role and the contributions of African-Americans to the profession, while not widely known to as many persons as it should be, is certainly a prolific record. In the case of Maryland, it was one that wasn't as clearly, as I said, delineated. And so I'm showing the records here from Leon Bridges, who came to Baltimore in 1970. And as I said, he was sort of recorded as Maryland's first Black architect. What we are going to look at now are all of those Black architects that actually predated Leon Bridges' arrival to Baltimore. We have uncovered more than 150 sites that still exist throughout Maryland and Baltimore that were designed between 1901 and 1970 by such individuals. And I'm going to show you thumbnails of a select few, which are about 20 of them. We have uncovered nearly 100 of them that meet several distinctions. They either held offices in Baltimore, or rather Maryland, and some in Baltimore. They practiced in Baltimore or Maryland, or they actually had a registration and had projects in Maryland. And so a number of these that I've showed out of the 20 were elected to the College of Fellows, as you'll see in bold. And then a number of others were AIA members, and then some were not members of AIA. Two African-American women that I'm featuring here are Martha Cassell and Alberta Cassell, who were the daughters of a prominent African-American architect here in Maryland that I'll be focusing. And they also worked for their father in the late 40s on various projects, the 40s and the 50s in Maryland and also in the Baltimore area. I am going to focus for the essence of time, since we have just a short review here, on three central Black architect stories relating to Maryland, and three sort of key Black architects that will help us to weave a nice tapestry of the early Black architects of Baltimore. The first, and I want to highlight education, would be Ralph Victor Cook, who graduated twice from Cornell University, a bachelor's and a master's, 1898 and 1900. And then he came back to Baltimore and took up residency at the Douglas High School as a teacher who taught manual drafting and arts from 1901 to 1946. And he trained a number of African-American students who went on to become African-American architects. One of his most noted students was Albert Cassell, who graduated from Douglas High School in 1914. Ralph Victor Cook was also very involved in the Baltimore Urban League, and as a result, was very active in sort of the practice. Albert Irving Cassell, who was born in Towson, Maryland, just on the outskirts of Baltimore, and then, as I said, graduated from Douglas High School, went on to Cornell University, and then he began practicing here in Maryland in 1925 until his death in 1969. He, according to the records that we've uncovered, is Maryland's first registered Black architect. He obtained registration in 1938, and then he became an AIA member in 1946 and remained an AIA member until 1969 and his death. And then we'll look at Hillyard Robinson, who was a Columbia University graduate and was active in Maryland from 1927 to 1986. And he obtained registration in Maryland in 1940 and was also elected to the College of Fellows in 1984. There were several repositories that were very significant in our work. One, of course, was Howard University. Certainly they hold the lion's share of the records for Albert Cassell. And within it, I'm just showing a screenshot of some of the papers that we found that then connected us to other Black architects like Warren Gray, who worked at one point for Albert Cassell. And then we have his resume, and we could find other Black architects through that. John Dennis Sulton, who was another Black architect that worked for him, and then ultimately established his own firm, Sulton and Campbell. With Ralph Victor Cook, as I mentioned, he was on the faculty and sort of led the Department of Manual Training and Mechanical Drawing at Frederick Douglass High School. And he had, hundreds of Black students that he was teaching, manual training and drawing to. And of course, Albert Cassell was one of his most noted. Another noted was William Coleman, who graduated in 1938 and also became a Black architect. But Ralph Victor Cook also was a great inspiration to Cassell, who continued that legacy of going to Cornell as he did. And then you'll see where Cornell inspired, or rather Cassell inspired a number of his children to do the same thing. Locally here in Baltimore, Carver Vocational Technical High School was a big player in the production of Black architects as well. It was led by Dr. Saul Perdue, who also practiced. He was a Hampton graduate of architecture from 1933, graduated from Howard in 35, and he had a doctorate from Columbia in 1940. He had a practice with his business partner, Carl White, who was African-American as well. And they had a practice in Baltimore from 1933 to 1944. And then he was also principal of Carver Vocational Technical School until the 70s. And he was on a number of prominent boards, Johns Hopkins, Salvation Army, Commissioner for Baltimore Urban Renewal Housing Administration, and then his own alma mater and the Provident Hospital. Most remarkably, Dr. Saul Perdue was the architect for Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois's residence, which is here in Baltimore in the historic African-American community named Morgan Park. And Dr. Saul Perdue designed that house in 1939. It's very significant that Dr. W. Du Bois called upon Dr. Saul Perdue to be his architect. I'm showing you an original invoice from Perdue and White, which is Dr. Saul Perdue's invoice dated November 3rd, 1939, to Dr. W.B. Du Bois in regards to the architectural services that he rendered in 1939. Total architect's fee recorded at $172.16. He designed the house, as you see there on the right, and at one point there was some fire damage done there was an explosion, and Dr. Perdue had to redesign the house, and Dr. Du Bois engaged him another time for that. We also have a very significant home in Maryland in Baltimore County that was designed by prominent Black architect Julian Francis Abel that I insert here. Again, he had a 44-year career known as the architect in the shadows with Horus and Trumbauer, a prominent white Philadelphia architectural firm. And in 1915, Julian Francis Abel designed this massive residence in the Green Spring Valley community in Baltimore County. Unfortunately, Julian Francis Abel was not allowed to ever go to this site, or thus the building, but certainly he designed it much as he did many of the buildings on the campus of Duke University as well. It's important to understand how architects in general got their clients, but then to understand, as we look at the works of Black architects in Baltimore, how they equally got their clients. From corporations where the chairmen or the presidents, religious figures, i.e. through churches, through the government, through the classmates from their schools or their colleges, clubs, friends, and etc. And so within the Black community, particularly 1901 to 1970, when we're looking at this work, a lot of these projects obviously are being commissioned by the Black community within the context of that client type that I just mentioned. John Anderson Langford, who was DC's first Black architect to be registered, was also one of our early Maryland architects and did buildings in Baltimore, but did not have registration. One of his first buildings in Baltimore was in 1907, and no longer, it's been demolished. It was at Lexington and Vine Street, but it was a very prominent building, the Grand United Order of Brothers and Sisters of Good Hope. We only have now this archival record of such, indicating what the building was. John Anderson Langford also married the prominent bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church's granddaughter, Bishop Henry McNeil Turner's granddaughter. And as a result, he became the supervising architect of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so in Baltimore, he actually did the alterations for Mother Bethel in Baltimore when they relocated to Old West Baltimore at their current site, which was historically a Presbyterian church. And so in 1910, it was Black architect John Anderson Langford who did those alterations. He designed the new building for Colored YMCA in 1915 in Old West Baltimore on Druid Hill Avenue, a building they still use today. And then John A. Cox Moore, who was a Black architect who was called upon by the president of Bowie State University to design the Don Goodloe House, and that was in 1916. William Sidney Pittman, who worked on the peripheries of Baltimore and laid out Fairmount Heights and designed a number of buildings in that community in 1907, and he was first Black graduate of Drexel Institute. Here in Baltimore, Floyd C. Lewis, who was Black and worked with John D. Broome, who was a Black builder, who had a design build operation in the early 1900s here in Baltimore. And so on his staff, he had Floyd C. Lewis, who designed all of the buildings, while John D. Broome, who came from Wilmington, North Carolina, one of the Black sort of Black meccas of building. And he had a great and strong operation here in Baltimore, and they had a number of buildings I'm just showing too. The Asbury ME Church, which still exists, they built and designed in 1925, and then a prominent Black dentist in Wilson Park, which is close to Morgan's campus, in 1917, Dr. Albert O. Reed's residence, and both of these properties exist today. And then Albert Cassell began working in Maryland very early with another prominent Black architect, Arthur Segowens, whose advertisement I show here. He was listed as architect and builder. This advertisement is 1921, and it shows that he has the community house that he's designed for Sharp Street Methodist Church, which I'm showing off to the side. And then it shows other projects that he's listed, the new Oddfellows Hall, which I'll show you following, that he's listed as the architect for as well. And we find that Albert Cassell was also working with him on these particular projects. And so it seems that he may have been one of the mentors to Albert Cassell in getting projects in Baltimore in the early 1900s. This is the Oddfellows Temple at Saratoga and Cathedral Street in 1925 that both Cassell and Segowens both worked on. Cassell was first registered in DC in 1928, but in 1938, he did get his registration in Maryland, and you'll see that he worked on Provident Hospital in Baltimore before he was registered. So we're seeing them do work even before the registration. Maryland doesn't pass legislation for registration until 1935. He was hired by Dr. Carl J. Murphy to design his residence in Morgan Park in 1929, a property that still stands. And then Cassell himself was seeking to be architect developer. In 1932, he bought several, hundreds of acres down in Calvert County and was designing the Chesapeake Heights on the Bay. This is his 1938 registration for Maryland. He became equally prominent at Morgan State when one of his former teachers, again from Frederick Douglass High School, his physics teacher, became the president, the first Black president of Morgan in 1937, and hired Cassell to be one of the chief architects for Morgan from 1937 until his death, where he designed a number of buildings at Morgan that still stand, such as Harriet Tubman Hall in 1940, the chapel in 1941. In Baltimore, he designed the YWCA building in 1945. And then his AIA membership began in 1946, and we find more buildings that he's recorded through that application as well. He worked in Crownsville Hospital and designed buildings there in Crownsville beginning in 1950. And then he had several buildings that we find listed with him in the American Architects Directory from 1956 as well. His last building that he completed, he died in 1969, and it happens to be one of the buildings on Morgan's campus. The Talmadge Hill Field House was being completed the year that he died in 1969. Cassell left a remarkable legacy. He's most distinguished among architects, and Black architects in particular, as his son and two daughters followed in his footsteps. And also attended Cornell University 46, 47, and 48. And then he has two granddaughters who also followed in his footsteps, Paula and Karen. And Paula went to Cornell as well, 1976, and Karen went to Illinois Institute of Technology. We then look at Hillyard Robinson, who had equal experience. He also worked on the Provident Hospital. He did a number of schools, the Siler Point School, the Community Center and YMCA in Turner Station, the Defense Housing at Lyon Village, which is where Henrietta Lacks was in 1941. He did the public housing in Cherry Hill, which still stands, 1945. Worked to the Provident Hospital in 1968 with the expansion. And then several churches like Southern Baptist Church in East Baltimore. Cassell has been attributed to having more than 16 other different Black architects who we found to have practiced in Maryland and in Baltimore that had worked with him on various projects, had spin-offs, many of which created their own firms as well, which you'll see in bold. And one of Cassell's mentors was also Howard Mackey, which the Howard School of Architecture is named in honor of. Howard Mackey was actually the first Black member of the City of Baltimore's design advisory panel. And so we were finding all of these different individuals and their records and their contributions that have been overlooked. And then, of course, through Hillyard Robinson, equally, we find 7 different African Americans who equally had buildings and could be connected to this experience. And then Hillyard Robinson, most uniquely, his tentacles went out to several other nationally significant African American architects, like Wertner, Woodson, Tandy, who he had worked for at one point, and then later would do projects with. Paul Revere Williams, who did projects with Hillyard Robinson, namely the Langston Terrace, and then from the Mckissick family, Calvin Lunsford Mckissick. And so through both Hillyard Robinson and Albert Cassell, there are a number of African-American architects who would be a part of that sort of architect family tree, if you will, and several that went on to establish firms and firms that still exist, such as the Fry and Welch firm, the Sulton and Campbell firm, are firms that are African-American and still continue. Under the legacy of Henry Livis and John Dennis Sultan and Leroy Campbell, and locally here in Baltimore, they both opened offices 10 years apart from each other. Henry Livis started an office here in Baltimore in 1958, and John Dennis Sultan and Leroy Campbell opened an office in Baltimore in 1968. The singular person that they both used was a Baltimore native and African-American who participated in architecture, Edward Taylor, who was a graduate of Hampton's architecture program and then later received a degree from Johns Hopkins. His former professor, Henry Livis from Hampton, engaged him to open the Baltimore office in 1958, and Edward Taylor ran that office from 1958 to 1963. He then went on to work with another Black architect, Edward Rogers, 64 to 67. And then concurrently, he would do work with Sultan and Campbell, and he opened their office formally here in 68. They had had an office in DC, and he worked with them until 1973. And then he held his own shingle from 73 until his death. He was one of our oldest living architects in Baltimore and in Maryland until his death in 2018. So we have several oral interviews with him and a number of his works. But you'll see here, he opened the office at 620 Ascot Street in 1958, and they did several projects here in Baltimore. Under that, he was also the first president of the National Technical Association Baltimore chapter, which was founded in 1958 under the leadership of the national president, which was his former employer and former professor, Henry Livis. And the National Technical Association is sort of the precursor. It's established in 1925, but it's a precursor to the National Organization of Minority Architects. And then we find Edward Taylor working with, again, Sultan and Campbell, and they have a prolific career as African Americans, initially starting in Washington, D.C., and they were initially working with both Albert Cassell and Hillyard Robinson in those cities. And then they began doing work in the early 60s here in Baltimore City. One of their projects from the early 60s that's still in existence, the St. James Terrace, which they designed as new construction. These are records from the Afro newspaper. They also did alterations to the St. James Episcopal Church. They also designed the new, at that time in 1968, Oswego Public Housing, which is in Park Heights. And you can see from the headline from the Afro, groundbreaking for unique housing project. And then they designed one of the first major buildings downtown as a Black architecture firm. This is 1969 Baltimore Afro. Plans unveiled this week for multi-million-dollar structure at the corner of Pratt, Lombard, and Gay Street, a building that still stands. Architect for the structure, Sulton Campbell, a Black firm. And it's Edward Taylor who's also here in that firm and working on these projects as well. The developer happened to be Black. He was the brother to Victorine Quill Adams, who was Little Willie Adams's wife. So these prominent families and these prominent Black movers and shakers were, engaging these African-American architects to do work. So just in the case of a firm like Sulton and Campbell, whose legacy at 57 years this year can be traced all the way back to this Ralph Victor Cook, to Howard Mackey, to Albert Cassell, to Hillyard Robinson, to Mr. Sulton and Leroy Campbell, to Edward Taylor, and to, of course, now Stanford Britt, who Sulton and Campbell brought to the firm in 1975 to run the Baltimore office. And so this is just a snapshot in so many ways of the research that we've been able to uncover and lift the veil from in regards to early Black architects of Baltimore from 1901 to 1970.
Thank you, Dale. This was a great presentation, and I'm getting a lot of feedback here from people who are saying how much they appreciate this. Actually, one of the attendees, Chris Safes, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, is nephew of Edward Taylor, and appreciates you talking about his work here. And we do have some questions coming through. One is, if you are interested in learning more about these architects and projects, where can you go to find more information?
Yeah, so we're working on several things as it relates to the work that I've just showed, that we are going to be developing a traveling exhibit that will be able to obviously move around various parts of Maryland, because certainly we have been focusing in this case on Maryland and Baltimore and et cetera. But we ultimately, seek to have this become, publicly accessible digitally, which will make it more available to the widest, audiences, if you will. And so those are some of the things we're working on with it. And then secondly, we're effective starting next week, we're going to be working on 1970 to present African-American architects in Maryland. And so it's very important that while, as I said, we, sort of went backwards from 1970, starting with Leon Bridges, and we've done many interviews with him, and we'll be doing more with him. We're going to be picking up more of the Leon Bridges and the Gary Bowdens, and even coming forward to those that are more contemporary, that are African-American, male and women, and capturing their stories. And so that will be a new component to the work that we hadn't been embarking upon over those past 10 years. So there'll be a lot more to come.
Great. And I do have to issue a correction here. Chris is the niece of Edward Taylor. Sorry, I got that wrong there. I have a question here from Julian Storbs, who's asking if any of the buildings you talked about have been included on the National Register, or if there's an effort to include more of these architects on the National Register.
Yes, so great question, Jillian, and also thank you, Jillian, for earlier on certainly engaging students from Morgan in your work with the early women in architecture of Maryland, and also being a great supporter of this work. Jillian and I have actually co-presented the work as she presents on the women And I've been presenting on the Black architects. But to answer your question, yes, several of these buildings that are still standing clearly, since they are pre 1970, they are, historic buildings, and many of them are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Some of them are individually listed, and many of them are listed as part of a district. But that was a great question, and some of them are designated. We will certainly look to see that we can get more of these listed on the National Register of Historic Places and protected, because some of them are buildings that are quite vulnerable and are threatened. So we need to seek active preservation measures to protect those legacies as well.
Great. And I have a question here from Damian, who's wondering about the community of Black architects in Baltimore. He's asking, did these African-American architects attend the same churches, frequent the same restaurants, or engage in similar recreational activities?
Yeah, so historically, those that I showed, yes, they were part of a strong social fabric and community, and many of them shared, of course, the same colleges or high schools, or were members of the same churches or organizations, or operated in similar circles. And so absolutely there was a strong community. Many of them, as I was trying to show as well, they were the mentors to that next generation, and they either collaborated on projects or assisted each other with establishing an office and so on.
I have a question here from Shunda, who says that I'm a park ranger, works at the MLK Memorial in DC, and recently found out about the Mckissick firm. I'd like to know more about the firm and family. Is there more information available?
Yes, there's a lot of information online, actually, in regards to Mckissick and Mckissick. And so certainly, and since you're in DC, Daryl Mckissick is actually located right in Washington, D.C. with the Mckissick and Mckissick office, and she is accessible, and certainly you could, reach out to her. But nevertheless, there are a lot of sites that feature the history of Mckissick and Mckissick online.
And I'll end with this question, and it's an interesting one. I'm really interested to hear your perspective on this one, Dale. Are there any trends or shifts in architectural styles or approaches, building, construction, community engagement that were developed by these early Black architects?
So that is a very interesting one. We haven't quite looked at it that way, but certainly I will, take that question into further consideration. And who did the question come from? I wonder if there's a way we can get back to them on that.
It came from Amina Muhammad.
Okay, yeah, so if she could reach, she can find my information via Morgan's website as well. Be happy to look into that more strategically to give a better response for that.
Well, okay, and we just have like so many comments coming in, and I'll share the comments with you after this day of just people just expressing their appreciation. And there was one person here, Rhonda, who mentioned that she's a Black architect practicing in Maryland. She got licensed in 2008 when there were 300 Black women architects nationwide, and now her understanding is that it's up to 400. So
no, it's crossed 500. So we still have a long way to go, but it has crossed that 500 mark, and so there's still much more work to do.
Great, and with that, we'll close the Q&A, and I want to mention that one program that BAF and AI Baltimore are working on is an exhibition called Say It Loud, where we're looking to have minority architects, particularly Black architects, submit to be part of the exhibition, which will be debuting this summer, and also in person at the Center for Architecture and Design at One Charles Center this fall. So if you go to aibaltimore.org, you can learn more about that project. We'd love to see some of you all who are architects here submit to be part of that exhibition. Thank you.
Very good, thank you.